That's good.
From Belgrade University, he will talk about trust in falsehood, definitions, sources, and challenges. I think this is an appropriate talk to have after Donald Trump getting elected for a second.
Sure.
For a second period as the president of the most republic of falsehoods. So let's hear your thoughts about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it is timely, and when we agreed on the date when this will be, I only afterwards realized that it will be on the, day after the elections. And actually it is also interesting because of what they call in the political sciences year of the elections, when I think there is largest number of elections in both democracies and autocracies where people go to vote, and everyone was looking toward elections in the European Union for European Parliament, and by the end of the year there will be other elections. So keeping track of whether democratic or autocratic candidates go through with their policies. So I think the score is still not settled. We'll see. There were some surprising victories when it comes to democratic option. And maybe I get to some of these kinds of discussions in the course of this talk. So a bit of background, actually pertinent to this. So how this came about. The main cluster of topics that I'm dealing with has to do with issues such as democratic backsliding, with political polarization, with problems of disinformation, misinformation, things that we will talk about today primarily. But one of the notions that did seem to be a bit missing from the literature, which tends to do with analysis of empirical data, has to do with the notion of trust. And as you will see, although it seems to be somewhat of a fairly easily readable phenomenon, you ask people who they trust most in different countries, in different domains, and then they say, well, I trust X, Y, Z, or they rank their preferences in order of the level of their trust. There actually is a bit of a problem on how to quantify trust and how to, more than that, explain it. The falsehoods, so the other part of the title, is also not as easy to decipher, even though intuitively we do know what is disinformation, what is misinformation, and some other instances of falsehoods that I will talk about. And the key thing here that I will try to do, it can go many ways. I will try to offer definitions of the concept of trust and to summarize what it is about the category of falsehoods that elicits the kind of response that we have seen in the United States when it comes to the notions of, or in other countries when it comes to the notions of people with autocratic tendencies coming up on top, and what is also important in the context of polarization, for instance, the other side not understanding how it is that someone can believe all these things. One side not understanding the other is one of the driving forces of polarization. And in some other talks, I would go through the definitions of polarization, but here we will assume it intuitively in order to make the theme of some other notions here. And the approach that I will try to take, and the approach that I'm trying to take in all of these clusters of issues, is to apply the strategy of what Rawls termed reflective equilibrium. So you want to try and make theory informed by the empirical analysis, and you also want to try make empirical research informed by the theory. And I was very surprised when in some of my research visits I talked to political scientists and asked them, well, to what degree do you collaborate with philosophers? And they were very surprised when they heard the question, what do you mean? Why do we need philosophers? Well, perhaps to clarify some concepts that you're using. But that's not how they see it. They say, well, we do know a bit about concepts. How do you know? Well, we research it. empirically. But then, as I will try to show you, when it comes to trust, there are many methodological issues when you try to actually research trust empirically, and when you try to research falsehoods empirically without paying attention to the conceptual framework. So trying to make the two communicate was my approach, and we'll see how it goes. It's in progress. Let's begin with a preliminary definition of the concept of trust. So the background for this definition is that in the literature on trust, you have a very different categorical classifications of what trust as a phenomenon is at all. So one of the most prominent accounts says that trust is an expectation. Another prominent account says that trust is behavior. You have another which says that trust is a psychological trait. These are three completely different kinds of things, and as far as I can tell, trust is neither of them, but these are the prominent accounts. So they say trust is an expectation in the sense that if I borrow you some money and expect that you return it, then that means that I trust that you will return it. But again, with that kind of definition, you can easily run into counterexamples, because I can borrow you money without expecting that you return it, or with some mild expectation that you return it, but knowing most probably you won't because you haven't done it in the past. Why do I lend you the money? Because maybe you're my child and I cannot force myself to resist your inquiries. Trust as a behavior has a similar line of finding counterexamples where you behave contrary to what could be your trust in someone. You know, you help someone and you maybe confide in someone because you trust them, but that kind of behavior doesn't always reflect that you trust someone. That is another problem. When it comes to saying that trust is a psychological trait, that is a bit closer to the phenomenon that, as I can see it. The problem with this is that there are many psychological traits, and that trust seems to be a bit too broad to just be one psychological trait. But it is, I think, correlated with different psychological traits. And one of the lines of work that I have recently undertaken with a colleague who is teaching and practicing psychiatry is finding what kind of maladaptations in one person can be correlated with levels of trust. And why is that important? Precisely because of the phenomena that you have when you analyze democratic and autocratic states who believe in disseminated falsehoods. In the simple question which you ask, well, why would someone believe what they believe? I cannot see why someone would maybe willingly be deceived when it comes to certain accounts in the media. Why would someone constantly follow media which are proven to be false? It's a phenomenon I encounter where I come from, where they did, for the most popular newspaper there, they did a fact check once. It's not as developed as in the United States, but they did it. They fact checked headlines on the main page, so just that. Headlines on the main page during 365 days of a year. They found that there were 400 falsehoods in those 365 days in the headlines at the front page. So that was a few years ago, and it has continuously been the most popular newspaper. Why? Because it's cheapest. That's how the picture can go. So you wonder, well, why do those kinds of things happen? Why do people believe in those kinds of authorities? Or why do people find some sources of information authoritative in that kind of way? And again, when you try to contrast that in the polarization accounts, why do some others fail to understand those kinds of phenomena? Why do people follow these opposite sources of information, and what makes them believe in each respective source? Part of the picture, I think, has to do with psychological makeup, but it's too early to tell what exactly. So that's the work we are currently trying to do, and to find what kind of traits do correlate with trust. But Again, trust is not, as far as I can tell, a psychological trait. So here's the definition. Trust is an attitude that a citizen has with respect to a certain person, politics, institution, or society, partly constituted by the conditions in which the citizen was born and is living now, determined in part by rational expectations from the object of trust, in part by the affective profile, and in part by the values the citizen holds. This attitude directs the citizen to act in a certain way and renders the citizen inclined to make a certain choice when the opportunity arises. And to sum this up is that there are multiple aspects of trust which, as you have seen, I have tried to categorically subsume under attitudes, because I think attitude is sufficiently broad to properly inform this phenomenon of trust, with multiple components which will become important as we go through different types of falsehoods: cognitive, affective, evaluative, and motivational. And that's what we will return to in the final part of the talk. So here are some of the types of falsehoods that I'm trying to categorize. So misinformation and disinformation are the most common ones that you find analyzed. Malinformation is, for me, a much more interesting type of falsehood than the first two. We'll see why. You have fake news, conspiracy theories, rumors, alternative facts, spin, propaganda. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's just a sample of what it is that we encounter when we try to analyze this kind of information. And we have it here again. Fake news, defined as false stories that appear to be news, spread on the internet and other media, usually created to influence political views. So what do we do with that? Well, first, let's define these three main types of false information or falsehoods. So this is from UNESCO's Guide for Journalists. Misinformation, so these are, let's say, official definitions as far as I can find something close to official definition. Information that is false but not created with the intention of causing harm. So disinformation, information that is false and deliberately created to harm a person, social group, organization, or country. And malinformation, information that is based on reality, used to inflict harm on a person, social group, organization, or country. So this is why I find malinformation especially interesting, because these are falsehoods that contain grains of truth, and that makes them the most pernicious and the most dangerous. But we have a problem. So we see here what is the distinctive of each of the types of falsehoods. The characteristic thing for misinformation is that it is created with the intention of causing harm. It's not created with the intention of causing harm, so you do not have that intention, just inadvertent causation. Then disinformation is deliberately created to harm someone or to cause harm. And also malinformation has that kind of intentional component. So you have misinformation, which is to some degree distinct from disinformation and malinformation. Now, there are other types of focusing on falsehoods. I'm just now trying to get this out of the way because I think this is an interesting way to list different types of content. And it's good to know that there are such other accounts. I will go over it a bit later why I think the other one is better, simply because it's more general. But see, here you have satire, parody, misleading content, imposter content. That is one that is now becoming very prominent with AI. Fabricated content, that's called fake news. False connection, false content, context, or manipulated content. So each of these are interesting, but I think that we simply find the talk of disinformation, misinformation, here and there malinformation, which is sometimes subsumed under the concept of disinformation wrongly. But there we have definitional problems. Here is, I call this the landscape of deception. So the different kinds of ways that we can have the connections between. This is also very provisional because it can go either way, but for instance, misinformation can lead to conspiracy theories, to fake news. Propaganda leads into disinformation. Malinformation also leads to fake news. You use fake news to spin something. It's not that important for now. Here's the important thing. How do we think about these types of falsehoods? Because you have at the same level misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. And here are the main characteristics. No intention to do harm, unknowing dissemination of falsity. Intention to do harm, knowing dissemination of falsity. These are two combinations, but you can easily see that there could be more. And what to do about that? So, two key questions. When it comes to definitions, there always are. Are definitions adequate, or are they too wide or narrow? And I think they're too narrow on two accounts. So for one, it is possible to disseminate falsehoods knowingly, without intention to cause harm, but with intention to solely gain certain benefits. Or it is possible to disseminate falsehoods knowingly with the goal of benefiting others even. So contrary to causing harm, so-called white lies. So one simple example for 1A are sales calls. So someone tries to cheat you a bit out of your money, but it's more or less benign. So they're selling you a vacuum that doesn't work really well, not causing harm, but it is quite, it is a type of misinformation, or it's something else, but it's not easy to see how it fits into those definitions. But it is created, it is a type of falsehood. Then 1B, which is a more interesting type of thing, it's when you have an intention to do good by saying false things. And why I mentioned early discussion of herd immunity, vaccination, and masks, because you remember that authoritative figures came out at the beginning saying that you do not need masks because they needed to preserve masks for medical staff, that you rather need gloves, where they knew that you didn't need really gloves, but you needed more masks. So they didn't want to cause harm. They did cause it. The greatest harm it caused is actually a loss of trust, which is what we'll get to. But it can happen, so it doesn't fit neatly into the misinformation or disinformation camp, because it's not done with the intention to cause harm, but it is a falsehood. And now to go more toward the epistemology of these types of statements, are they on the same level as they seem to be discussed as? So this is where we get into a bit more complicated matters. So misinformation fundamentally differs from disinformation and malinformation. And here is the depiction that you should have, not as them being in the same row. Here it is. So you can classify them as such by the quality of content and by the epistemic state of the carrier. So when it comes to the quality of the content, you have as a key component false statements in both. But the epistemic state of the carrier, so that they do not know that they're engaged with false content, is distinctive of misinformation. So you shouldn't put them on the same level. The same type of thing, the same statement, the same false statement can be misinformation if I don't know that I'm spreading a falsehood, and disinformation if I know that I'm spreading it. So, and the same with malinformation, because it's truth combined with falsehoods. So let's say, as the most famous example, you have the talk about consequences of vaccination, MMR for instance. When the falsehood that MMR vaccines cause autism was disseminated, there was one grain of truth used, that there is an uptick in diagnosed cases of autism, and it was couched in the fact that there were more MMR vaccinations during that period. So a false correlation with something true was used to persuade the public to be afraid of the vaccines because of autism. In that case, people who disseminated that content, not knowing that it was false, because how could general public know really that it was false if they do not have all the information, or some of the information at least, Well, they couldn't. So many people were just afraid and wanted to share that with others. So from their perspective, that was misinformation. From the perspective of those who had interests in lowering the trust in the vaccine, it was malinformation. So, and here is where the epistemic state of the carrier becomes more important, and we will see how it connects to the notion of trust a bit later. So here is how you should look at that continuum. You have the information, disinformation, and malinformation. Because you have a quality of the content, it can be true or false. So that is why you need information which is true, and disinformation and malinformation which are false at one level. And when it comes to the epistemic state of the carrier, what you know that you're disseminating, there you get misinformation, or again, you can get proper information for people who know that they're disseminating true claims, like scientists, for instance, in case where that is true. And here we have two further questions. So one, is the concept of information truth neutral? Or can something be called information only if it is true? In other words, do we have rights or do we have justification to talk about false information, as you can find it discussed commonly? And the second, is relaying a message or uttering a proposition problematic even when it is true, even if an utterer isn't aware of its veracity or the reasons for it? In other words, is the only thing that we want to achieve having truths being spread across the media, social media, or through conversations? Intuitively, yes, but there are problems with that claim as well. So the first thing, let's just see if we should move on, not yet. So false information, yes or no, I guess that depends on how you want to use concepts. Strictly speaking, if you want to maintain the precision of this continuum, to know that on the one end of the spectrum is something that is true, then you have something that is a combination of truth and falsity, and then you have something that is outright false, so doesn't contain any grain of truth. You should keep those kinds of things separate, because information, strictly speaking, isn't false, and you shouldn't speak about false information. It sends a wrong message, and it doesn't use the concepts properly. I mean, false information is almost like wood and iron. So we should keep that in mind. And now the more complicated question, which is not so intuitive perhaps, it's how to treat truth and falsehoods in terms of what people know about them. Do they know why something is the case, why they believe something? And that is one of the most important questions that I think are not sufficiently discussed. And here is why that could be the problem. So let's say that here in this room you don't have any windows, and I come from the outside and I say, hey guys, it's raining, so do you trust me or not? So you cannot check it for yourself. You have to trust me if you want to properly wear coats, bring umbrellas, whatever. So how would you know that I'm a trustworthy person? Maybe you know that I am that I have never deceived you before when those kinds of situations came up. So what you're using there as evidence for your trust, or for the basis for your trust, is the history of veracity. Okay. Sometimes because you don't have all the information anyway, when you're looking at the Weather Channel, maybe you weigh whether that Weather Channel was wrong or right before in order to say whether you trust them. But in any case, you do not have the information for yourself. So whether do you trust them or not? But here you can check at least, because the history of veracity is fairly easily susceptible to examination. So you do that and you say, well, okay, I know that AccuWeather is usually correct. I'll bring my umbrella for today. Fine. Let's move on to the true expert testimony, which is usually used as a ground for proposing solutions to restore trust. Do you trust scientists? And you can say, sure. Proper scientists with history of publications that are peer-reviewed are trustworthy. But then again, that turned out not to be the case always. Sometimes scientists decide that even though they did things the right way in the past, now it's for some reason better to engage in something else. And now you use a mental scientist to disseminate something that is malinformation or disinformation, and that we also saw happen. So how do you see that and not lose general trust in experts? That's the question. Well, one thing is that you shouldn't only look at whether experts were saying true or false things. You should see what is the reasoning, what is the methodology, what is the process behind arriving at some true claims. And for that, you can also remember John Stuart Mill's recommendations on liberty when he's talking about discussions being important even in cases where you're certain that you're correct with people that you think are wrong. Why? Because it is always possible that someone's reasons are better than yours. Second, because by discussing the views that you find true, you strengthen your reasonings behind it. And third, because in doing that, you will believe what you believe even more firmly. And something that Mill also implied, but through deliberative research we have found out in the past 10 or 15 years, when you discuss with other people with whom you disagree things reasonably, the polarization comes down. So you may not go toward the consensus, but you better understand why people think what they think. And that is always the greatest mystery when it comes to these clusters of questions, why people think what they think. And how is that then relevant when you're talking about combating disinformation or malinformation or spreading reliably information? You cannot do that in general terms. That's the problem. So one way that you will find is common is to say, well, these media who spread fake news, who spread disinformation, they are no longer reliable. People just need to realize that. They need to reach sources of information which have proven to be reliable, and then read them, and then they will be informed. But it's not that easy. Why? Because of trust. Why because of trust? Because it is surprisingly hard to make people click, open, read things that they are not thinking are already in line with what they think is true. So in other words, confirmation bias is a big problem when you're trying to do those kinds of things. Confirmation bias being maybe, and that is not quite so easy to say that it is irrational to have confirmation bias, because sometimes you do not have the entire history of the world at your hands, nor do you have enough time to check everything. So sometimes you have to be quick in your thinking, you have to take shortcuts, it's evolutionary, and that can be used against you as well. The online algorithms are commonly discussed as reinforcing that type of an issue, constantly recommending you the same types of feeds or news sources that you already look at. So that then closes you off in some sort of a bubble. And that is where this kind of phenomenon actually was reinforced with the internet, even though 20 or 25 years ago we thought, well, only if people had the opportunity to read other news sources easily, they would be better informed. Actually, the research in autocratic countries shows that it is quite hard to make people click on things that are in opposition with official line of thinking, for the people who follow the autocratic, let's say, majority. Here I'm talking about electoral autocracies, not about, you have this distinction between electoral autocracies and closed autocracies. Closed autocracies are more in line with what you think commonly as a totalitarian state. Electoral autocracies are, on their surface level, they still have all the civic mechanisms that democracies have. It's just that they are misused in a specific way. And even though you can have, when you don't have, let's say, oversight over the internet, as in China or in Russia to some degree, now it's probably as bad as in China. When you have all the information sources available to you easily with 2 clicks, writing 1 word to reach the portal, which is more truthful than the one that you're following, people don't do it. And even if you show them what they say, they won't trust it. Why? Because trust as a complex attitude is very difficult to achieve, even when you have, which is perhaps surprising, even when you have a history of falsehoods behind you. It's still not something that you can do. And it's a mystery why, if you have this sort of utopian thinking about people, at least a little bit being rational about the things they believe in. Well, maybe they are rational, but it has a framework of something that, let's say, of a bubble that cannot be easily burst. And maybe sometimes when you burst it, you get even worse consequences. So it's a very diverse field of things that can go wrong. And when you say we want to combat disinformation and malinformation, you have to be very careful not to ask for strategies that will make it worse. For instance, when scientists were accused of disseminating falsehoods, the response to that wasn't better science or more science. It was less science. It was more pseudoscience. And one of the big takeaways, I think, from these elections yesterday in America were that a lot of votes for Trump went to him because of the Kennedy Jr. thing, i.e., I am against the establishment and here is how everyone is deceiving you. Why do people trust that everyone is deceiving them? Because they lost maybe trust in some particular instance of one part of the system, but then they generalized it. Why? Perhaps because they were already inclined to think that system is against them. But that system then took everything with it, not only a particular reasonable examination of one scientist's errors, like you do when you say, do peer review, you say, go back and check. No, you do not throw everything in the trash. Well, here everything went into the trash for a certain sizable amount of people. So how do you combat disinformation and malinformation? So here we return to the definition of trust and particular aspects of that attitude that we have to bear in mind. So we saw that we have rationality, affective profile, values, and behavior. And when you, for instance, analyze polarization, you see that there is a stark disagreement, both conceptually and empirically, between a plain disagreement, even deep disagreement, and polarization. For instance, we can here debate whether it is a good idea to achieve energy independence by building nuclear plants. And half of the room may say yes, half of the room may say no. We can disagree vehemently. The role of our discussions will be maybe to analyze our views, but it can remain at that level. We won't hate each other for suggesting otherwise. But take a look at a disagreement where values are involved. Let's say the debate about reproductive rights. It was also a big part of the election cycle. If people feel that their values are violated, whatever those values are, they will be much more inclined to get closed off for any kind of discussions. So you won't be able to get to any reasonable point without it. And you also, of course, have to take into account that concepts of rationality and of being reasonable can vary in cases where you have low level of information available, or where you are in the case of or deciding in situations of risk or low probability outcomes. Then you get all the machinery from decision theory, where you have all the instances of sometimes irrational preference ordering, sometimes different kinds of mechanisms for deciding what is reasonable that are mutually incompatible. So it's not already there, you don't have an easy path toward explaining what it is that should be done. But at least for now, you can see that these four components are relevant. And here it is what is important for that list of falsehoods. It is that I think that different parts of the landscape of these deceptions affect us in different ways and appeal to different aspects of trust, thus defined. Some appeal more to a rational side, some to our emotions, like fear, hopes. Some target our value structures, whereas some directly pretend to render us active or inactive. So sometimes the message is, stay at home, don't do anything. For instance, don't get vaccinated. So they're telling you not to do something. Sometimes they're inciting you to do something, like it was for January 6th in America. So now I'm using these examples because it's all now very current. But that's one instance. Someone trusted people when they told them, don't do this. Why? Because probably they were afraid. But here's the point. It's not always the same. You cannot use general definitions and you cannot use general strategies when you talk about combating disinformation, because trust is a complex attitude that varies from case to case and from types of case to types of cases. So this is one very broad illustration. I mean, it would take a lot more text to explain everything properly. But plausibly, I think at least preliminary account of misinformation, disinformation, etc. can tell you perhaps which of the aspects of that complex attitude of trust is targeted when disseminating them. Why is that important? Because you will need a piecemeal analysis in order to understand how to combat or how to restore trust of people who were affected by some of these types of things. It would be very time consuming to do, but that's something that I think you have to do. You cannot make a sweeping strategy because you can go wrong. I mean, if someone is targeting cognitive or rational part of your view of the world, meaning information, knowledge, etc., you cannot appeal to it effectively. It will just be ineffective. Or if someone is preying on your affective profile, someone is playing up on your fears, there you have a mismatch if you try to say, well, here is the proper information for you. It will not work because they're afraid. You have to address that first. Also, sometimes you have evaluative structures that are targeted for different people, so whatever they are. If you again try to appeal to them effectively, you may make it counterproductive or make it even worse. Or if you go toward the cognitive or rational aspect of the thing, again, it won't work because values are deeply ingrained. So it's not as easy as just learn the right information. That has to be done very carefully in order to understand first how to pinpoint where it is that trust has got lost, then why, then what it is that a person would respond to if they were to be open to change their attitude, and also not to change it towards something that is even worse. And here you can think about different types of trust or distrust. And I'll give you an example. And that goes back to the part of the reasons for thinking something and support for believing in some things. So, epistemic part of the story. And epistemologists like to talk about, traditionally about justified true beliefs, but more recently this kind of framework has been expanded and made more detailed and more nuanced. But still, basically, when it comes to the trust that you put in something, it can go wrong even if you operate with true statements. For instance, let's say that you do not think that vaccination is dangerous, so you will go and vaccinate. That's good, but if you leave it at that, you have the following problem. Some people will think that because they maybe read through some proper publications, saw studies, or properly believe in scientific methodology that led to the claim or to the statement or to the conclusion that vaccination is safe. Some, however, and this was the case when the pandemic was raging and the vaccines became available, some will say that because they heard it from an authoritative source at the state level, for instance. And that's what happened in Serbia. So you had, for one, people who use social media where pseudoscientific claims are mostly disseminated, and a large percentage of young people who use that trusted that vaccines are wrong, bad, part of a conspiracy, and didn't want to take them. Old people who were more akin to trust the news sources, even when they are wrong 400 times a year, they were told on TV that to get vaccinations, and they were there in line getting patiently vaccinations. What's wrong with that picture? Except, well, the first part is wrong, obviously, because trusting in social media has its own sets of challenges. But in this case, where they held true belief, vaccinations are safe for me, the source of that was only some man on the news who they trusted for some irrational reasons. And when from that source there were no more recommendations to get vaccinations after the first 2 rounds, they simply didn't get, for example, boosters and further because they weren't told to. So then they did have this type of belief that vaccines are safe, but they were simply not convinced that they should act. So that wasn't part of their trust profile, wanting to act. So here you can make a distinction between 2 types of trust in true statements. You can have, let's say, proper trust, critical trust, or you can say it's an enlightened trust, or you can use something less ambitious. But the point is, you can also have dogmatic trust. And dogmatic trust can be as bad as plain distrust or trust in false sources of information, because dogmatic trust can flip easily to some different type of authoritative statement. Because if the same newspapers told them, by no means get vaccinated because that's bad, they would flip their beliefs at that point, or return them back when new headline popped up. So it's not a reliable way to predict what it is that people should do or how they ought to approach this set of falsehoods. So combating that is not as easy. I mean, no one thinks it's easy, but it's not as straightforward as recommendations in literature and in research sometimes tend to think it is. And because it can go wrong and it can be counterproductive, we have to be very careful in first researching empirically these different kinds of attitudes through discussions with people, and we have a framework of deliberative discussions that are taking place, and they're bringing out of people reasons and more rationality and more openness toward discussions. And you can use that framework to try and apply these kinds of first analysis, and then formulate at the second step some sort of particular piecemeal types of approach for resolving this problem. So let me conclude with 2 points of further possible inquiry. So one, an obligatory mention of the AI, sorry for that. You have a, we can call it information paradox that can exacerbate the problem. You would ask it what something is, and it can tell you. So do you trust it? It would seem that because there isn't human element directly involved, a portion of people could find it more reliable. It's simply what machines are designed to do, to give you accurate, reliable information about the world. So because no one is trying to deceive you, because there is no one there, you can maybe trust it more. But you have a problem, because there is no one there, so there are no intentions behind producing any particular reply. There are just sets of words, which is actually, let's call it a message without a messenger. And without a messenger, you're not really sure who to point to talk about either hallucinations or how to do things better, or what happened when you got false information back. And that can then flip perhaps this initial dogmatic trust in, well, here is this thing that should give information reliably, to, oh, this is wrong. I will trust someone who maybe seems to be, part of a counterculture, who is here for me because we are all in the same mess, because the system is against us. So it can exacerbate the problem as much as it can potentially help fix it. So we have to have this in mind, and that's the end of the AI story. The second is, because the strategy is so piecemeal, because it's so particularist, and because these profiles are even individualized, that's why you need more than just empirical data and research and just asking people for their output, because sometimes you have the transparency, self-transparency issue, something Kant was talking about at several places, which is we don't always know why we think what we think. And when you ask us something, we can tell you, but how reliable are we also? Not just how reliable we find some others to be. Even when it comes to our own opinions, why do you want to vote for Trump? Somehow, I don't know. Maybe if you ask me, maybe I would say, well, he's against the system, but I won't be able to elaborate it better than that. Or I'll vote for him because I'm mad at the other guy or the other candidate. So, do you trust him? Well, you can say that you do, but you don't really trust him. You just want to be against the other guy. So, that's where you have the problem of discussing or of quantifying or researching trust, because self-reports are not really reliable, and you have the so-called equivalence problem, meaning if I ask all of you here to rank your preferences, to tell me whom you trust, and you say, well, I trust, for example, a socialist party in Portugal, MAS, I think they're called, so you can all trust them. But if I ask you this one single question and you give me one single answer, behind it could be 6 different reasonings. So you can trust them to fix the economy, or someone can trust them not to fix the economy but to fix the border, or not the border but to fix some, or you like some particular aspect of cultural policy. So you actually give 6 different answers instead of one. And my questionnaire or my survey doesn't capture that. So in the end, I think I know whom you trust, but I don't know why, and I cannot detect different reasonings behind it. And if the circumstances change, my models for fixing maybe the problems of trust or for diagnosing it aren't nuanced enough, because actually you have 6 different attitudes, not one attitude of trust. So, in the end, these are all the things that we have to think about when we try to delineate our strategies, our diagnosis of the problem, to start working on a solution that wouldn't be perhaps even harmful in the long run, And all of that, I think, remains to be done in future work. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now we have a quick Q&A session. So Jose, just check if anyone's online. If you want to make a question, raise your hand. Somewhere over here.
Thank you for the talk. You divide in 4 points, like cognitive, affective, and relative. But for me, cognitive is so broad and embrace all of them that I don't know. And other question is why you don't talk about ignorance? Because we believe in falsehoods because we are ignorant and we stop to searching for the truth. And this, I think, is a good thing. We never need to stop to continue the researching, you know. ChatGPT give false information too.
Sure.
And if you accept and you don't continue searching, you believe. And
Of course.
And I think it's normal we think in falsehoods and the contrary, it's true is right.
True statements.
This is the definition of the thing, the way of thinking. Anyway, we always have falsehoods. I think it's not possible cut all falsehoods and.
Sure. Thank you. Both good questions. Because the definition is already complex as is, let's call it a working definition. Sure, you can divide rational component into more than just saying that name like rationality. And that would certainly be done in detailing the work when you're trying to really apply the definition. That is why I mentioned reasons for believing in something. What is your motivation for doing that, for thinking the way you do? What kind of mechanisms of, let's say, inference you apply? Did you arrive at the thing that you believe, which is a true statement, by applying, let's say, the type of inference after that does because of that, or not? So if you did, then that would mean something different than if you use proper modes of inference to arrive at the same thing. And that is also part of the reply to the second question. Ignorance of the facts, as I said, maybe it's the final step, not the first step towards resolving these kinds of problems. Because it assumes that you don't know something, but someone shows you, okay, here is what is the case, and then you say, all right, that's good, now I know. But take debate about climate change into account. Do you believe that there is a climate change or not? You have people who won't be persuaded by any number of models painstakingly explained to them, well, here is what happens, and here is what are the mechanisms of global warming or generating El Niños or whatever it is that they're talking about. Here is why there are more hurricanes or why they're stronger. Here it is, and here is what this means and what this means. And they will say, no, it's just numbers and graphs and, yeah. So you need to establish something before people are open to learning the information. And that is, I think, where we go wrong. You know, we see that people believe in wrong things and we try to present them with the right ones. But again, first, inherently, it's not always clear what the right thing is. And the second, even if it is, people are not always receptive to it. So how they become receptive to it is a big part of the story. And that's what I try to convey with this. But I agreed. At some point, or in some instance, or in some phase, hopefully, there is this step as well. You know, learning how to inform people, how to make them more trusting in experts, because no one can know everything. You know, you have to, at some point, you have to rely on people knowing things that you don't, and you can never check. That's the case. But for that, I think you first have to establish the attitude of trust in these different aspects.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I have a question about the attitude of the person who does those things. And so you distinguish them by saying that there's one of it, so that's why it says based on reality, and we also mentioned there's a grain of truth, and I'm just wondering what exactly do you mean by that? So, you know, you can, so let's say somebody reports that the politician has said this and this in a particular place in a particular town. And that is based on some grain of truth because he or she was in that particular town, place in that particular town, right?
Yeah.
So I guess, you know, anything can be based on a grain of truth. Okay, maybe if you say that, you know, they're aliens or something, maybe that not, but
sure.
So yeah, so I'm wondering if this reliance on based on reality or grain of truth, if that's enough to distinguish them, and how do you conceive it?
Yeah, thank you. Well, as I mentioned, these official definitions are not really perfect, and they don't capture all the nuances of these kinds of things. But I think what they mean is, of course, you're right. Even when it comes to plain disinformation, some things about the thing will be true, of course. But for the relevant parts of the statement that is in question, is it entirely false? For instance, Kamala Harris says that she would ban migration outright, and you can even generate an AI image of her saying that. Or you speak about some economic measure, or let's say tax cuts, and which can tend to produce some effect, but then you say all the things around it that can make you think that, well, this is not a good economic policy, even if for some instances it is. So in the relevant portion, whether there is some truth or not, in the relevant for the particular message, that I think is what they're aiming toward. Because you can have an outright false information, different from where, I mean, it's easier to combat outrightly false information because for malinformation you can point to a grain of truth, something true. Let's say, as I mentioned, uptick in cases of autism, and you can have the temporal incidence of these cases with the amount of vaccinations, you know, famous mistaken correlations, but still.
Exactly. So
it can.
The statement is not true in any sense.
Well, it is not true that vaccines cause autism. It is not true that there is an established mechanism for it, but it is true that during the period where there was an uptick in vaccinations, there was also a rise in number of diagnoses of that case.
But it doesn't support the statement, right?
Of course, but you present information in the sense that you connect them, and thus you create malinformation. And then you have to tell people, well, no, it's not because of that, but maybe you have better diagnostic tools, we have better understanding of the case. But it's too late. They've already been afraid, and it's not easy to combat it. And they'll say, well, and you can go in a very complicated, nuanced stories about, especially in medicine, when you go through that literature, that malinformation literature, where people who are trained doctors, or sometimes just trained biologists, but they purport to know something about medical field as well, they will use terms, they will use some insights, they will use some data that is correct, but connect it in a way to send the wrong message. And I think it is important, that's why they do it, to distinguish that as being malinformation from disinformation just being, let's say, a campaign trail statement that someone said this, but they didn't say it at all. In that sense, I think that could be made to be different. Because in the message about vaccines and autism, something key to that message has been true, while everything else has been false in that context. While in the case of disinformation, some, let's say, external things to the message have been true, but something that is crucial to the message has been entirely false. So maybe that's the provisional distinction, but I agree. I mean, all these definitions need much more nuance. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Sure.
Can you show me the table with the different kind of falsehoods? It was a figure with the...
That or?
Not the other one.
This one?
The last one.
Oh, you mean with the...
motivation.
Okay. This? Okay.
So I was wondering where would you insert like the Frankfurt notion of bullshit? You know? Because bullshit is you don't have any epistemic, orientation.
Yeah.
You really don't care about if it's true or false. You're just expressing something that you don't even believe, or
Yeah.
if it's true or false. And then I was wondering, so basically, I'm working on trust in AI,
Okay.
specifically in healthcare.
Okay.
And we have a big discussion about what is trust, because some people claim that trust is reliance plus something extra.
Okay.
And I was wondering how would you classify trust in this sense? Like, do you think there is a distinction between trust and reliance? And reliance would be a weak form of trust, or not? So do you think we can trust a computer in this specific sense, or you can trust your car, for example, that it will brake, or the plane that you will not fall, etc.?
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, great questions. So bullshit I didn't include because it's not that big in the research in political terms. Simply people don't use bullshit as the Frankfurtian term of choice when it comes to political communication. You don't find it that much. I mean, you mention it, you do at the level of, maybe academic research or so, but not in the media. People much more think about in these kinds of terms, broader. I mean, bullshit is a bit subtler than this, especially because you have this kind of debate, cognitivist, non-cognitivist debate embedded in it, whether it's just an expression of a sentiment or it's a proportion to say something but not true. Maybe it would be closest to malinformation in a way, being something that combines, something truthful and something disingenuous. Or maybe it can be also completely disingenuous, but there you would go into the analysis of intentional component of it. Maybe sometime that's what I mentioned with misinformation and disinformation. What is the epistemic state of the carrier? So that's where you can classify the same statement as being misinformation or disinformation based on the intentional profile of the utterer, and bullshit would come somewhere in there. I think we could talk about this from the angle of the utterer. What's bullshit? The other part of the story would be how it affects the recipients of bullshit, and it can be persuasive, and if it is persuasive, then you have the problem similar to the problem of disinformation or malinformation, but again, it would be piecemeal. So you can include it in the analysis, it would be interesting, you just have to see concrete instances of what falls under the Frankfurt definition of bullshit. So we would have to see. If you have some example, we can go through it within this framework. That's one, and in other words, maybe I could put it on this table. As I said, this is not exhaustive, so you can maybe combine some of this into something else, or you can spread it, make it even more nuanced. This is just an illustration of how I think we should broaden these categories. And what you say about trust is reliance, in AI that is very, very interesting. What I mentioned with reliability here, I think it pertains to this a bit. Trust is reliance. Well, it would be a bit similar to these definitions which I mentioned about expectation and behavior. So trust is expectation or trust is behavior. Reliance seems to combine expectation and behavior. I expect my computer to do the work for me, so I behave in that way. I use it. I use the computer to create this presentation, relying on it to do it properly. And maybe you could say that that means that I trust it. My problem with it would be that sometimes reliance is there out of necessity, not based on trust of something. So I rely on something because I have no other way out, or because everything else seems worse to me. For instance, I have a child who is problematic, uses drugs, etc. But I behave toward that child as if I'm trusting him, because I don't have strength to do anything else, because I'm hoping that that will give a positive example or that would reinforce some good in it. But if you ask me whether do you trust him to do this in this particular instance, I would say no. Sadly, no. So reliance in that sense could capture too much. I would like it to be more specified. So that is why I was thinking about how categorically to what is the genus proximum, you know, of trust, what kind of thing it is. So that is why I came to the attitude as being something which is my approach to things, which has these different components, which some can be present and others can be absent based on these cases. I think we need a bit broader things. So if you want to go with reliance, you would need, well, to specify it in order to not confuse reliance that you detect as being actually based in trust. So when you specify it, I think you would come up with something else actually. That is not strictly speaking reliance, but something else, behavior as if, or conditional approach to something. But then I think you come up with the attitudes again to describe this phenomenon of engagement with something. So when it comes to whether you trust your car or you do rely, I mean, I see why that is possible. You rely on your car to get you from A to B. But for instance, I have an old car and I don't really trust it to always get me from A to B. I hope that it will get me from A to B. I don't have another car available, so I use it. I rely on it because I have no better option. So that is what I would like to avoid confusing, because even if you confuse within the complex attitude, you confuse different components, you come out, as I mentioned, with different problems, with different diagnosis of problems. So I would like for trust to be specified in some way. So it will be interesting to see what kind of candidates for this additional component to reliance are and how to specify it. And yes, in broad terms, I could say that you can talk about trusting tools that are at your disposal. But I don't know if I think that it is inherently let's say, trusted more than we trust other tools, mechanical tools or cognitive tools or whatever. It's just a landscape of things that we have to use to reach some goal, you know. And I agree we can over-rely on that as well, which can be damaging in other ways.
So my question, first thank you for this very interesting presentation. I think this is a very important theme in our current times, and I was thinking of something that might not fall under the scope of this discussion, but I still want to ask you because I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this. So I definitely agree that there is a strong affective and motivational component to these phenomena that we are witnessing, right? It's not just cognitive, there's something emotional at work that leads people to be more open to accept information when they come from certain group. And my question is, how do we tackle that without resorting to the same sort of manipulative strategies that these groups that spread falsehoods resort to? I know this is a hard and difficult question, right? Otherwise, the issue would have been solved by now. But I just want to know how you feel about this.
Sure. Thank you for it's a very appropriate question. In different lines of political research that I'm doing, both theoretical and empirical, I'm finding that the data shows that these deliberative discussions that I mentioned can be very fruitful. You have even indices, for instance, you know, like an index of discourse quality, which can measure the performance of people within those discussions by looking at components such as if you have a topic of discussion, whether people were sticking to that topic, whether they gave reasons for thinking what they think, whether they were interrupting others, whether they were cooperative. They have tracked, for instance, transformative moments, which are when for instance, it starts bad, the discussion starts bad. It is people interrupt each other, don't want to listen to each other, they are unhappy with opinions being expressed, but slowly come to terms with that it is legitimate to think something else, and then discussion becomes better. So all in the scope of one event, say 2-hour-long event. So I think because it seems to me the strategy has to be piecemeal, and I think in general it's an instance of what is termed the bottom-up approach in politics. And you have similar types of, like the question you asked, you have similar types of questions when it comes to autocratic states. So how to amend autocracy, how to make it more democratic, or how to prevent democratic backsliding, which is the decline of democratic components of a society toward autocracies. For example, in the past 30 years, you have stark rise in the number of autocratic states globally. So and within democratic states, you have turned toward autocracy. This is why this election year is very important also. So how to combat that? It has to do with this. But generally, I don't think you can avoid this bottom-up approach where you try to engage as many people as possible in some sort of immediate interaction with themselves and with the people they would perceive as experts or as authorities. And it's not as easy as make them more informed or show them the truth. It's more time-consuming than that, and it takes a lot of work to make these bottom-up approaches work even locally or even at the level of one single event. And I think that's start of the way, but that's just the first step. You cannot avoid it. As far as analyzing what is going on, I think you cannot avoid it.
Maybe having discussions that are focused in local communities would be helpful, because a lot of what happens has to do with the use of social media, right? Where people just find like-minded people and they just
well, yeah, definitely. Well, for that reason, a few months ago I was in Belgium trying to explore how they do that, because they have them among the most developed, deliberative, and generally democratically innovative scenes, where they try to engage citizens at the local level in discussions pertaining to their communities. And even though Belgium is a robust democracy by all indices, they have problem motivating people and getting them sufficiently informed about their opportunities and rights within the discussion and what can you do with it. You know, that you have these kinds of innovations such as participatory budget, for instance, where a municipality can set aside 50,000 euros for citizens to decide how to spend on some facade, on some monument, whatever they want to. And even there, where you have immediate influence on what to do, it's not easy to accomplish, but they're doing it. And yes, I think that local involvement would be tremendously important, and participating in these kinds of discussions could make citizens more empowered to think in the way that would make them then more conducive to these kinds of strategies. So I think that could be an important option to include when setting up these kinds of discussions. For now, they are just thematic in the sense of this local politics, which is important, but I think people should do more with it.
Thank you for the talk. I have 4 questions.
Sure.
The first one, do you have a definition or a concept of information to compare it with misinformation, information, and malinformation?
Yeah.
Do you want to answer, or may I ask?
Well, one at a time is maybe better if you have 4. Okay, so the first question again?
It's about the definition or the concept of information to compare it with disinformation, malinformation, and disinformation.
Yeah. So let's return to that. This one? As I think the key thing is these two are false. This one is defined by the intention. So no, there is no intention to cause harm. So because of that, I think it actually falls at a different level. That was the point. Here. So if the intention is the point of distinction.
That I think I understand.
Okay.
I'm asking about information, the definition or a concept.
Oh, you mean how to add the definition of information to this? Well, it's both easy and hard, you know, because you don't have some accepted definition of truth, you know, but some type of veracity or correspondence to what is actually the case. I could also perhaps include reliability if I went after some recent, or not that recent, debates in epistemology. You would need to have a reliable source of information. That means proven track record, solid methodology, the process of investigation which is adequate to the subject matter, lack of intention to deceive, lack of any competing interests, you know, the things that intuitively fall under it. I would want that to be the components of a definition, and I think then you could make it, you know, say that the epistemic state of the carrier when it comes to information is also genuine. So I genuinely believe that what I'm saying is true, just as in misinformation, but what I'm saying really is true and I know why. And I know maybe how I got to that truth. But you will always have some type of inherent, I mean, if you're not doing math and logic, you will have some type of inherent probability attached to the things that you're claiming. You will always have a possibility for being terribly surprised by the new developments in the world and saying, well, no, the thing I thought was the case really isn't the case. That's for the more complex things. But for the simpler things, such as who said what, who was where, who was supporting what policy, sometimes even these things are contested, even though they're easily verifiable. But there, I think, at least for that, you can have this set of components. I don't want to make it a definition, but let's say this veracity, correspondence, reliability, etc. Yeah, make it a case. Again, it's not. There is a reason why there is an entire line of debates when it comes to definitions of truth and different candidates. But for this particular context, I think it can suffice. And if it comes to that we need to change something about it or to make it more nuanced, well, we can do that. It is the case that one should never be too overconfident or dogmatic about what they're doing. So part of establishing, let's say, critical trust, which is not an unhealthy skepticism, is being aware of the possibility of error. And we should do that with our definitions as well.
So truth by correspondence with the possibility of revision of your belief.
Sure, you want to make it sufficiently open. Yeah, you want to be flexible in that regard.
Maybe you can make one more question from the ones you have.
Yeah, sure. No, ask, I mean, okay. Okay. No, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you can ask all the questions you have. Yeah, just one by one, I mean.
Thank you.
No problem.
I'm very interested in this.
Sure.
Is information, do you think that information is independent of the subject or the person that perceives it?
For this context, not for every context, you know, you have, in philosophy you have this class of response dependence concepts, things that do in part depend on the subject who is doing something or perceiving something or talking about something, We have theories that, according to which if all of us agree that something is good, then that it will be good, just like all of us, if all of us agree that the word door means that, then that means that. So in that sense, it is good to agree on something and to have some sort of conventions. But for this part, because you usually talk about the state of affairs in the world, the intentional component is important to understand why you're saying something, but what you're saying will be somewhere out there, for the most part. You can also have cases in politics that if maybe all of us agree that tax cuts are good, then they will be good. But if we don't want tax cuts to work, then they won't work. So what that means about the policy independently of whether we agree with it or not, it's not easy to say. Wherever you have human agency involved, some aspect of behaving in a certain way will change what it is in reality that we can diagnose or detect or say is accurate. That is why there is, for instance, you have an interesting definition of truth, which is, James's, truth is what works, but not what works in some crude sense. Well, this works for me, so it is true. But if you open an umbrella and it protects you from the rain, there is some truths about how to construct an umbrella that will protect you from the rain, that will make...
Pragmatic truth from pragmatism. Pragmatic truth from pragmatism. The utilitarian notion of the truth.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah, like James said, you have to know something about the...
James, yes.
Yeah. That could be interesting in this context. What works? Maybe my understanding of the society I'm living in will lead me to propose a policy that would be well fit for this society, and then it will work. Because I knew something about sociology, about economics, about history, about culture. It's not arbitrary what works. It's not just utilitarian. James hated that notion. It has to be rooted in reality, but it also has to do with how it relates to what we do and how it affects us. So, in that sense, I think that's how that could go, But again, it's not something that is universally accepted. So, I think that no general solution would really work. Like, no general definition will cover everything that needs to be covered. And you just have to be open and flexible in that regard to recognize when that happens, amend something or add something or formulate a concept that would cover that kind of thing. So beware of general approaches, because they will be very difficult to put into action, into policy or into a set of solutions, whatever. That leans into the whole debate in ethics about generalism, particularism. So, we will stay here all semester to cover that properly.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. As far as that's fine with me. If it's fine with you, yeah. Okay, go ahead.
I don't know if this is a naive question, but
okay.
Do you think trust is correlated with the information being the first information that a person receives?
With it being?
The first information.
Oh, you mean if where I initially learned something will influence how I trust that source, and it will be difficult to revise in the further instances?
Exactly.
Yeah, sure. Well, empirically, mostly yes, but depends on the cases. So if I already trust a source and it tells me something about some topic first, so I have these newspapers which I trust and they tell me something first there, I will think that's okay, that's accurate. And I will not be susceptible to revisions afterwards from some other source. And even if that source tells me second thing, which is contrary sometime later, that also may prove to be a difficult thing to revise. But again, It really depends on the topic, on the source of the information. Generally, there seems to be some bias toward what you get first and what you get second. In research, for instance, on the trolley problem, where they ask people what you would do, you know about the trolley problem, right? That's yeah. What do you do? Whether you let it kill 5 or you intervene and kill 1. So they asked them what they would do, and they detected change in responses based on which alternative they offered first for similarly stratified groups. So if they say first, would you let it happen? And then this, they would more frequently say, yeah, let it happen. But if they said, well, would you kill 1, not to affect the 5, or would you let it happen, then they would choose the first option. So there is some bias, but it's called recency bias sometimes, and there is a recency bias. If you heard it recently, if it's the first time, then that would be more persuasive. If it goes against something that you've known for a long time, then it becomes murkier. But that kind of thing would definitely fall under the heading of cognitive biases that we have, and there's, again, too many of them to cover here.
The last one is about the table of contents that you showed.
Okay.
Did you use empirical data to make that table?
Not particularly. It's more of an amalgam of what I found in the literature. So I don't know of some particular classification that would cover all that, but I know there are some additional categories. I know that some categories are not that important anymore, such as fake news. The alternative facts were trending for some time, but not that much anymore. So, and fake news are subsumed under disinformation mostly, and malinformation is not prominent that much. So, again, it's just an illustration. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.